Good afternoon, the board. Communications.
Why don't we hold on 1 second? Having a little bit of possible technical difficulties here. With sound? Okay, very good. Sorry for that interruption, Chairman Kashishian. It looked like we did have some technical difficulties that might be resolved. We just completed with roll call, and at this point you just called for item 2 on the agenda, presentations and commendations. Today we have none. Chairman Kashishian, members of the board, at item 4A, we have the minutes from our March 17, 2010 meeting. A complete set of those minutes was sent to you in your packet in advance. Prior to that, I did have an opportunity to review them, and upon my review, they appeared to be consistent with our record of the previous meeting. And with that, if you saw any need for revisions, we would be happy to have you bring them to our attention. Other than that, we would appreciate a motion for approval.
I'm sorry, yes, we have a motion for approval of the minutes from March 17, 2010, previous meeting.
Second the motion.
Okay. Thank you.
There has to be a first and then a second.
That's correct. It was moved and seconded, and at this point, it's appropriate for a roll call.
Board Member Deborah Dentler. Board Member Michael Chikmajian. Board Member John Tatulian.
Aye.
Board Member Alexander Wu.
Aye.
I think that was it.
Okay, the next item on the agenda.
That might be the difficult.
Okay, so thank you for that. Now we'll move on to the next agenda item, item number 6. No, I'm sorry, item number 5, old business. Is there any old business? None?
Today we have none.
You have none. Thank you. Item 6, new business.
At item 6A, we have an introduction of our Building and Safety Code for the City of Glendale 2001. That is the purpose of our meeting today.
2011?
I'm sorry, 2011. Thank you for that correction. Going backwards a little bit there.
No, 2010. We're not 2011.
Well,
But it will be
just around
our
the corner.
Glendale Building and Safety Code 2011. Thank you. For those who have not participated or viewed this process before, our city has an extremely open process, and rather than just presenting this ordinance to our city council once and then following up with adoption at a subsequent meeting, is everything okay?
Yes, make sure your buttons are turned on at your mics, please.
Yeah, I think that was a technical difficulty we had
I think that's
earlier.
it. I think we're okay at this point. As I was saying, we have a very open process here in the city of Glendale because we are receptive to ideas and suggestions from the community at large, and then also from technical boards such as yours. And so in addition to our normal introduction of the ordinance and followed by adoption by the city council, we have not one but two public meetings in order to present this to our city, and this is actually the first. We will follow up in exactly 1 month back with this board. We use this as a public forum to enable individuals that might have some suggestions or ideas of things that might be appropriate to incorporate into the Building and Safety Code, and they can certainly present those at any time to this board even after this meeting, up until the next time we meet. At that time, we will take any suggestions or recommendations that you might have, and we will incorporate them into a final draft. At that time, with the assistance of our city attorney, and I just saw our general counsel, Christina Sansoni, walk into the room. With the assistance of our city attorney's office, we will take that final draft and do a little bit of administrative cleanup for our formal presentation to the city council. After which, 2 weeks after that, we will be seeking formal adoption, and it would then take effect on January 1st of 2011. Before I turn it over to staff, and we have some capable people in the audience that will be presenting this to you. I did want to point out and acknowledge the hard work by Fire Prevention. Fire Marshal Halpert and his staff did work extremely hard on Volume 6, which is part of your packet, which is the fire code. And then I also want to acknowledge members of my staff, because it's not often that staff gets an opportunity to be acknowledged, but in particular Chris Sagas and Jan Edwards did an outstanding job on the remainder of this particular package. This is a huge, absolutely huge undertaking, and we do it every 3 years to follow the state Title 24 Building Standards Code adoption cycle. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. But before I do turn it over to them to give you a brief overview of what it is that we are proposing to present eventually to our City Council, I did want to go over it very briefly for the benefit of this board so that you understand fully what it is that we're doing. That being said, let me start by briefly describing what the building code is, where it comes from, and while some of you board members might be familiar with this, some of our viewing public might not. And so this is also for their benefit. The code that we enforce here in the city of Glendale is comprised of a number of volumes, which include the familiar portions of the code: building code, mechanical code, plumbing code, fire code, electrical code, and so forth. But this is really our local adoption of a much larger code, which is referred to as the Building Standards Code, or Title 24, the California Code of Regulations. In particular, Title 24 is composed of 12 different parts. Some of them are very familiar to you, and then some are not. And while we might be expressly identifying some of these in our adoption process, I do want to point out that all of them are actually part of Title 24, and they do carry the full force of law, whether or not we choose to locally adopt them or not. If we choose not to adopt any portion of Title 24, it becomes the law of the land here in Glendale as adopted by the Building Standards Commission. But to get started, let's talk about those 12 parts very briefly. Part 1 is referred to as the California Administrative Code. Part 2 is the California Building Code. Part 2.5 is the Residential Code. Part 3 is the California Electrical Code. Part 4 is the Mechanical Code. Part 5 is the California Plumbing Code. Part 6 is the California Energy Code. Part 7 is left vacant by the state. Part 8 of Title 24 is the California State Historical Building Code. Part 9 is the California Fire Code. Part 10 is the California Existing Buildings Code. Part 11 is the California Green Building Code, something that we will be talking about today because it is new. And then Part 12 is the California Reference Standards Code. Without getting into too much detail, I do want to point out that our authority to locally adopt the code and, if necessary, make amendments to it is found in the California Health and Safety Code, Section 17958.5, and also, to some extent, Health and Safety Code 18941.5. Those are generally the statutes which indicate that every local jurisdiction shall adopt the California codes and, if deemed necessary to protect its community, may locally amend those building standards if it can justify those local amendments on the basis of either a local geologic, topographic, or climatic condition. And that's what we'll be doing. Part of what you will see today is not only the proposed amendments to this broad set of codes that the state has adopted, but we will be presenting the justification for them as well. I do want to point out that this process actually started some time ago. The Building Standards Commission adopted the state codes, those 12 parts of Title 24 that I just referred to, back on January 12th of 2010. So it has already been adopted, and those standards take effect on took effect on July 1st of this year for all state-owned buildings. At that time, it became effective at the state level, and all local jurisdictions, such as the City of Glendale, then had 180 days after the publication date of July 1st in order to locally amend those standards for our own use. And that's the process that we're in right now. And what we're hoping to do is go before our City Council twice in November in order to have a local ordinance passed with these amendments, so that with the passage of 30 days after that, it would take effect on January 1st. So while I mentioned what the different parts of Title 24 are, there's sometimes some confusion regarding which model codes comprised the state codes. And so I do want to identify exactly which codes it was that you were looking at. The basis for the state codes were the 2009 International Building Code, the 2009 International Residential Code. This is the first time the state of California will have enforced a residential code. Prior to this coming cycle, all residential standards were taken out of the building code. Now there is a dedicated code just for residential construction. Oh, I see that we're getting ready here to go through the presentation. Why don't you back up, Chris? I'm going to have you go over some of this on your own as well. I just want to go over a simple overview. In addition to that, the model code that was used for the California Fire Code was the 2009 International Fire Code. The state also used as the basis of its code the 2009 Uniform Mechanical Code, the 2009 Uniform Plumbing Code, and the 2008 National Electric Code. I want to talk very briefly about the state agency amendments, and then I'm going to turn it over to staff before I jump too far ahead in their presentation. There are 5 state agencies out of the many, many agencies that regulate activities within California that we are very, very tightly merged with, and those are HCD1, which deals with permanent residential facilities, HCD2, which deals with mobile home parks, which we have none in Glendale, but I do want to point out that any state amendment that is promulgated by HCD2 is legally effective throughout the state. The State Fire Marshal's Office, which is responsible for the majority of the amendments in the state code. DSA-AC, which is Division of the State Architect Access Compliance Unit, and that is the state agency that is responsible for all of the disabled access regulations that we enforce. And then finally, OSHPD 3. OSHPD 3 is one of 4 divisions in the state that deals with healthcare facilities, and in particular, they deal with licensed clinics and outpatient services. With that, I'm going to turn it over to, who's going to go first, Chris or Jim? I'm going to turn it over to Chris Agus, a member of the Building and Safety Plan Check and Engineering staff, who, as I mentioned, did a fantastic job in putting together the code. But before we do that, if in the camera room, I don't know if Brian or who's handling the camera, if our camera can point to the back of the podium, or I guess it would be the front of the podium. I have a set of codes that have been set up, and thank you. And what I want to do is I want to point to the board's attention and to the viewing audience at home. What you see on the screen is what is commonly referred to as the building code. Some people think that the building code is one small book. It is not. While it is referred to in California as building standards law, and in the vernacular, it's simply referred to as the building code. It's actually comprised of a number of volumes, some of which are familiar: the building code, the fire code, mechanical code, electrical code, plumbing code, and then there are a bunch of other building standards. The actual codes that we enforce here in the city of Glendale are too many to fit on that table. They would fall off the sides. But that is probably the portion of the building standards code that we enforce most frequently, and it's been a lot of work. So I did want to point this out because, as I mentioned, Mr. Agus has done a tremendous job going through this code to compare it with our last code to determine whether or not previous amendments needed to be advanced forward or if new amendments needed to be done. And with that, we'll have a short presentation by Mr. Agus. Chris.
Good afternoon, board members. Before I proceed, it was not just me that prepared the documents. I'd like to also thank Celeste with her help, with Jan's help as well, and also with Stuart's help in guiding us through the process. So, and for the benefit of the board members and also for the viewing audience, what we would like to do and ask the board members is that if you have any questions during the presentation, we would like to hold off those questions until at the end of each volume. Jan and myself are going to present the new code, and after each volume, then you can go ahead and ask your questions so that we can speed up the process. Thank you. Our previous 2008 Glendale Building Code previously comprised of basically eight volumes. And the new volumes we're going to be introducing today now comprise of basically 9 volumes, as you can see from the board. This triennial code cycle is similar to the last code cycle. However, as you can see from the board, there are 2 major differences. Okay. The California Building Standards Commission adopted basically 2 new codes that we have to enforce, as Stuart indicated. And one is the California Residential Code, which is Part 2.5, and also the Green Building Standards Code, which is Part 11.
Correction, Volume 9.
Oh, I'm sorry. Next. Okay, as you can see from the next slide, these are the CVSC adopted state codes that we are enforcing, and anything that you see from this presentation and on in the light blue is things that are new. So when we present the amendments, you'll see some of them, with the exception of fire, but those are basically anything that's new for this coming code. Next slide. Okay, and these are some other separate codes that have also been adopted. They are the 2010 California Energy Code and also the 2010 Historical Building Code. And at this time, there are no local amendments being proposed for this code. So, with that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Jan Edwards, and she's going to go ahead and present Volume 1A.
Well, we're switching presentations, and Ms. Edwards takes over. I do want to point out that the very last volume of our building and safety code, which are the Green Building Standards, is something that's currently undergoing its development with the direction of the City Council, and so that's not a critical portion of review or presentation to this board today. There have been open public meetings for several months now on green building standards for the City of Glendale, and we will actually be going to City Council seeking a little bit more guidance and presenting to them the results of our public outreach later this month. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to review Volume 1A, Building Standards. The 2010 California Building Code is based on the 2009 International Building Code. California proposed a lot of, or has adopted a lot of amendments, and then Glendale's Building and Safety Code proposes further amendments. Most of the amendments that you have in your packet to the 2010 California Building Code are duplications of amendments that we've had in the past. They may have been renumbered or relocated to change the organizational format that is in the 2010 California Building Code. For example, administration. The administration amendments and regulations had previously been in Appendix Chapter 1 of the 2008 California Building Code, or I'm sorry, the 2007 California Building Code. In the 2010 California Building Code, they've been moved to Chapter 1, Division 2. So as a result, we've had to relocate the majority of our administrative amendments from the appendix chapter to Chapter 1, Division 2 to match the format. So although if you were to compare the two codes, our last one and this one, you'll find those same code amendments just located in a different place within the older building code. Two areas that we are changing from the past is with respect to work exempt from permits. We're adding, we're changing an exemption to for fences and retaining walls to change the minimum required height to be more restrictive for Glendale. This was a regulation that was recommended by our planning division to assist in the enforcement of other parts of Glendale's regulations, such as some of the items that are in our municipal code. So this helps better coordinate the whole family of codes. So that is a new amendment for this code cycle. The second one refers to unlawful acts. That's a code section. In switching over from prior codes, which were UBC-based, to the IBC-based code, in this code section, we ended up missing a word. The IBC-based code doesn't have the word maintain in it. Our previous code did. We discovered that this created a real problem for our code enforcement section of Glendale, and prevented them from being able to properly enforce certain segments of construction that was done without a permit. By adding this word back into the code, then it will assist them in being able to more effectively and more efficiently maintain our city standards. So we're proposing to add that back in.
Before you go on, I would like to point one thing out. With the assistance of our city attorney's office, there was one additional amendment that will be introduced into the packet that you do not see right now. So it will be there before we come back to you in a month. And that is to be consistent with a city council action which extended certain active plan check applications to, let me see if I get this right, to December 31st, 2011. And so since that was an action taken by City Council by ordinance, and that remains in effect, we will have a provision in the code carry that forward so that that small set of plan check applications which were initiated prior to the effective date of this code, they will remain active through December 31st of 2011. While that's just a little minor administrative issue, I did want to bring that to your attention.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Continuing on, other amendments to the administration section are listed there, and they're basically word for word from what we've had in the past, our past Glendale Building and Safety Code. Another area where we changed in going into our general code requirements after we finish our administrative section in the Chapter 1, Division 2. Again, many of our code amendments are identical to what we've had in the past. They're just relocated to match the format of the 2010 code. We are adding a section in Chapter 15 and Chapter 31 to address the installation of solar voltaic panels and modules. This is a relatively new technology that hasn't really made its way into the state codes yet. And so we're using this opportunity to be able to address the requirements up front so that people aren't having to guess what's necessary in order to be able to install them. So these amendments have been added to address that new technology. Also, in the general code requirements, we're making some other changes in Chapter 31 to allow membrane covers less than 20 feet above finished floor surface, and also to address work on existing uses encroaching into the public right-of-way. The one where we're addressing the uses encroaching into the public right-of-way came up a year or so ago. This affects a lot of the older structures along Brand, along Central, and those cross streets that were built in the 20s and 30s and the early 40s, where we used to have the old, the storage elevator, the freight elevator in the public sidewalk that then went down to the basement and you could unload. Well, that technology is no longer used anymore. Those openings got covered over. The basements are slowly being converted to other uses. It's become a safety issue. An example of the safety issue was that the city was recently working on repairing a sidewalk section that it turned out to be over one of these encroachments. And a part of the sidewalk, because it was being removed to be repaired, a part of it fell through into the basement. Well, it wasn't a storage basement anymore, and it could have been a serious problem. So this amendment is being added to be able to address those issues, to make sure that the safety issue of the uses under the public sidewalk are going to be done in a safe manner, so that if the city is working on the public sidewalk for repairs or maintenance, we don't cause problems for the uses underneath those sidewalks. Moving on to structural amendments. Again, most of these amendments match what we've had in the past. They've just been reformatted to match the IBC and the CBC sections for in the 2010 volume. There are very few structural changes that most of these are changes that have been brought forward since the Northridge earthquake. The code cycle after that, these were introduced and they've been carried on from code cycle to code cycle. After the structural sections, we talk about grading standards, and we have Appendix Chapter J that has been almost entirely rewritten from the base code. This was done at the last code cycle basically because the IBC Appendix Chapter J for grading is very minimal. It's only a few pages long. Doesn't cover all of the different varieties of options that we in Glendale have with respect to hillsides, some of our earthquake areas, our Alquist-Priolo zones, our seismic hazard zones, and some other basic standards. So this chapter was virtually rewritten, coordinating with the County of Los Angeles and City of Los Angeles and many of the other local jurisdictions in the LA area. What was done the last code cycle is pretty much what we're copying over again in this code cycle as well.
Let me interject here. Appendix J that Jan is referring to is something that, as she mentioned, through concerted efforts with LA County and LA City, Glendale has one of the most robust grading chapters that I'm aware of in the entire state. We've had requests from many cities to secure copies of what we have amended into our code, And it's my understanding that many cities have taken what we have provided or what LA County has provided and have adopted that into their own. While the collaborative effort did include the City of Los Angeles as well, the City of Los Angeles chose not to go as far with some of the standards that LA County and Glendale did. Of course, we were very interested in protecting some of our hillside areas which had experienced or have experienced some superficial slide problems and so forth. And so that's why, as Jan indicated, we're carrying those amendments that we had last cycle forward. And so I'm very pleased to see that.
Okay, a couple of areas that we have changed since the last code cycle with respect to the grading standards is to clarify that geotechnical consultants and their role in preparing the grading standards and in providing their approval of civil grading plans and geotechnical reports, and to include MPDES standards within the grading standards so that everyone is aware that if they're going to be doing grading, they need to make sure that they protect the site and keep our stormwater clean and not contaminated. So we've clarified those elements. Additionally, we've clarified that when we're working on a hillside with a slope steeper than 3 to 1, that the grading plans must be prepared by a licensed civil or structural engineer, so that we do have a licensed professional preparing those documents. We've clarified that in this code cycle. And also, we've clarified the requirements of what happens when somebody is doing unpermitted grading, or if unpermitted grading is allowed for the scope of their project. So we've clarified that to make it a little bit easier for everyone to understand and anticipate the requirements when they apply for a permit. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris to go through the new residential standards.
Actually, before we do that, as Chris opened, in the interest of expediency, and then also because sometimes questions get resolved as a presentation advances forward, now would be the time to ask any questions if you have any questions on the Building Code Volume 1. If nothing comes to mind at this point, staff will be available for the duration of this development period until next month, and you could certainly submit those to staff and we will consider them. But before she moves on, if there are any questions or comments regarding Volume 1 Building Code Standards, now would be a good time. Good.
All right, thank you.
Well, maybe I can ask a question, just one. On the last item you
Okay.
just mentioned about preparing grading plans by licensed civil engineer and structural engineer, does that mean that City of Glendale does not recognize licensed architects to prepare grading plans?
If they're through the Business and Professions Act, they do that as part of their normal business, then yes, they would be allowed to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Basically, Chairman Kashishian, basically what the City of Glendale is doing, as I mentioned, our amendments to Appendix J make it much more robust. Essentially what we are doing is we are eliminating from the code any possibility that an unlicensed professional, specifically homeowners, submit grading plans to us. Our hillsides are too delicate in Glendale to allow individuals to propose plans for work that would require a grading permit, to allow that to be done without a licensed professional preparing those plans. In addition to that, the last slide that was shown also indicated that the second bullet on this slide right here indicates that requirements are being introduced for a geotechnical report for all projects requiring a grading permit. This is a key amendment that we are imposing locally here on Glendale. It's justified based on various topographic conditions and geologic as well, due to the seismicity affecting some of our hillsides and trying to prevent seismically induced landslides and things of that nature. What we are doing is we're imposing a condition that any time grading exceeds a threshold so that a grading permit is going to be required, we will always require a geotechnical report for that from this point forward.
Okay. Well, thank you for that
Thank you.
clarification.
Okay, now I'm going to present Volume 1B, the residential standards. As Stuart indicated in the beginning, the new California Residential Code is based on the 2009 International Residential Code. And as far as the California Residential Code and Volume 1B, it applies basically to 1 and 2 family dwellings up to 3 stories in height. And this includes townhouses up to 3 stories. It includes live-work units complying with Section 419 of the CBC. And what's not, and also it excludes structural requirements for hillside projects and wood frame construction that are greater than 1 story. So, and that's consistent with our previous code amendments. Similar with Volume 1B, there are many changes necessary for the new Glendale Building Code to match basically the IRC format and to be consistent with the 2008 Glendale and Building Code. In regards to the administrative portion of the Volume 1A, similar to, Volume 1B, and similar to Volume 1A, the detailed administrative provisions are located in Chapter 1, Division 2, and many amendments that are proposed in that Volume 1B is fairly similar to Volume 1A, if not identical with the exception of section numbers. So, and also several amendments were added at the end to be consistent with Volume 1A. In the general code requirements, as I indicated and throughout the presentation, many of these amendments are similar to Volume 1A and necessary to be consistent also with the 2008 Glendale Building Code. Some of the items that were amended in Chapter 3, amended to be consistent with the fire amendments in regards to fire sprinklers and smoke detectors. Chapter 4, we've actually added to refer to the California Building Code to Appendix J for any grading requirements, as well as in Chapter 9, we also made reference and amended to provide requirements for the installation of solar photovoltaic panels and modules. As far as these structural amendments, it's similar to what has been done with Volume 1A. A lot of the provisions that were in the California Building Code and also in Volume 1A were carried over into this new code. Many of the amendments are similar to the 2008 GBC, and again, also several of the amendments are new to address mainly deficiencies in the reference standards. As I indicated earlier in the beginning of Volume 1B, Chapter 1 amended to limit the wood frame construction, and this has always been in the code since the Northridge earthquake. So we've always limited wood frame construction to 1 story. And also in Chapter 4, what we did here is we amended to exempt soil report for additions and accessory structure that are less than 500 square feet. Basically, this was an administrative provision that and allowed the applicant to simplify the process of for smaller projects rather than completing a building modification that we have currently now.
Before you move on, Chris, let me bring to the board's attention a couple of things. The first bullet that's on the board, Chapter 1 amended to limit wood frame construction to 1 story. In case that might have slipped past you, the reason that is in there is Volume 1B, which is what Chris is discussing right now, are amendments to the newly adopted California Residential Code. The CRC has prescriptive acceptance of light wood frame construction. And what this amendment does is it limits wood frame construction to only one story if you choose to use the prescriptive approval standards. Of course, you will still be able to build a residential structure in excess of one story, but then the structural provisions within the IRC could not be followed. Instead, what would happen is the structural design parameters of the building code would govern. And that's for strength considerations because of, as Chris mentioned, all of the amendments that we have imposed upon the building code to make sure that light frame construction is handled in a manner which can resist the types of loads that we see here locally. We wanted to make sure that residential construction would not be allowed to simply follow the prescriptive standards in the residential code, because if you were to discuss those prescriptive design standards with most design engineers, they would tell you that they are a little bit less stringent than what you would find in the design parameters of the building code. So this amendment basically ensures that even though the residential code governs residential buildings, the design standards will match the building code. Does that make sense?
Definitely does make sense, but to clarify the matters, then, Mr. Tom, are you saying that the non-structural portions under CRC for a residential building will be still, the CRC will be applicable to three-story buildings for non-structural portions, except for the structural items only will be limited to one story? That means you will have to design it based on CBC requirements. But still the building up to 3 stories high, residential building will be
Exactly.
under the CRC.
That's correct.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And with that, that concludes Volume 1B of the Code Amendments. And if there's any questions, we'll answer them now.
Good.
You don't have any, I'll go ahead and Jan will present the next slide, which is Volume 2 and 3, which is plumbing standards and mechanical standards.
Thank you.
Essentially, Volume 2 of the Glendale Building and Safety Code refers to the plumbing standards, the plumbing code, which is based on the 2009 Uniform Plumbing Code published by the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, otherwise known as IAPMO. Most of the proposed amendments that we have included in your packet are virtually identical to the previous ones that we had in the 2008 Glendale Building and Safety Code. The exception is that we are specifically adopting Appendix Chapter G regarding gray water to be able to allow gray water use within the city of Glendale.
Excuse me, could you help me find that gray water provision in our packet? Do we have it in front of us?
You have the reference to adopting the the chapter,
Okay.
but we don't have the entire appendix chapter included in your packet.
Okay, so if I wanted to see that, I'll ask later.
Yes.
It's in the
Yes,
binders.
we have
That
it. We
is
have
correct.
Right.
That's a good question.
That's something that the public is interested in, so I wanted to make sure that it's not in my packet. I need to go to the binders.
Right. Board Member Dentler, that is actually a very, very good point. So let me go ahead and take the time to explain for the board and the viewing audience. Since the amendment that Ms. Edwards is referring to is simply adopting an appendix that might not otherwise have universal applicability, there will only be that adoption reference. Those standards already exist in the model code, not in the California
Right.
code, but in the model code. And if we had chosen to adopt and amend some of those standards, you would have had the whole thing in your packet. But since we are adopting them unaltered, then we only have the reference, and those standards are in the code book itself. That code book will be available up through the second reading by the City Council, will be available for anybody who is interested in reviewing in my office. And if they would like to see them, they can contact me for that.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions? That basically is the only thing that we're doing with the plumbing standards. So if there are any questions on the plumbing code. Okay. The next volume, Volume 3 of the Glendale Building Safety Code, refers to mechanical standards. It's the 2010 California Mechanical Code, which is based on the 2009 Uniform Mechanical Code published by the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, otherwise known as IAPMO. The proposed amendments are, again, very, very similar to what we've had in the past, and they're for administrative purposes only. We're not making any other changes, not proposing any other changes to the Uniform Mechanical Code. So are there any questions concerning the Mechanical Code? Okay, at this point, then, I will switch back to Chris for the next two volumes.
Okay, the next volume is Volume 4, which is the electrical standards. Electrical standards are 2010 California Electrical Code, which is based on the 2008 National Electrical Code. It's published by NFPA. The proposed amendments are similar to the Glendale Building Safety Code. There is one additional amendment that we've added, and that's to address the installation of solar photovoltaic panels, so which are located actually in Volume 6 in the Fire Code. So that's where all the specific requirements are for the installation of those photovoltaic panels. I'll go on to the next slide, and then we can answer any questions from here on. The Volume 5, which is the housing standards. Again, housing standards, we had no proposed amendments, and it's similar to the 2008 Glendale Building and Safety Code. So that concludes Volume 4 and 5, and I'd like to answer any questions that the board may have. There are no questions, and Janet. Then the next presentation will be Volume 6, Fire Standards by Jeff Halpert.
Chairman Kashishi and members of the board, before we move on to Jeff Halpert, while this slide, if you could put the last slide back up. Great. Perfect. I would like to point something out that sometimes, I'm sorry, the slide prior to this. Oh boy, maybe I'm lost. Could you advance one forward? How about, no, that's the other direction, forward. Standards. One more? There, perfect. I do want to point out, people often ask whether or not that first bullet is correct, that we are still adopting the 1997 Uniform Housing Code. That is correct. That is not a typo. California State Housing Law still references the 1997 Uniform Housing Code as the basis for housing standards here in the state of California. The Building Standards Commission is sometimes questioned regarding this, and I have contacted them myself, and they have indicated that at this point the state legislature has not taken action to change that reference. That remains the standard for the minimum housing standards within the state of California. But the good news is this: while that standard may seem to be outdated, the basic necessities of dwellings remains unchanged. In other words, a residential structure needs to be safe and sheltered from the elements, need to have proper heating in the winter, have proper safe and sanitary plumbing conditions so that it's not unhealthful to live in there. It has to have cooking facilities and so forth. So those standards have not changed. But I did want to point out that that 1997 reference is required by statute. Thank you.
Mr. Tom, may I back up to the electrical code to ask a question that I should have asked a moment ago? I'm sorry.
Board Member Dentler, you are welcome to back up
Sorry.
as far as you like.
It will be quick. I was just intrigued by the changes being proposed in the electrical volume section. Let me get the right number. Volume 4, Electrical Standards, Section 92 2.6, special permit to owner for work in own residence. And since in our packet all of the material in that section is underlined, I was wondering, does that signify for me, the reader, that all of this is brand new? We didn't have this section or something similar to it before?
That is correct.
So I'm kind of curious as to how that amendment came about, or that proposed amendment came about.
I'd like to defer that question. I'm not too familiar with what the previous code adoption cycles were in regards to that section.
I'm asking for just a very brief explanation, just so I can understand why we needed this. This seemed to me to allow the city to grant something called a special owner's permit when a person who lives in the home or intends to reside in the home wants to do their own electrical installation work. Just really briefly give me an idea of why we need that.
Board Member Dedler, I'm actually going to get back to you on that.
Sure, thanks.
This particular provision is consistent with the owner-builder standards, which does allow an individual in his or her own owner-occupied dwelling to do all work necessary to construct and even to maintain or alter their dwelling. Why we would require a separate section on this, I'll need to clarify that.
Sure,
later.
thank you.
And I'll make sure I have an answer before the next meeting.
Sure, thank you.
And who is next? There we go.
Chairman Kishishian and honored members of the board, thank you very much. I'll briefly run through the next series of slides, only a few slides regarding Volume 6, which are the fire safety standards. As an overview, some of this is repeated from what Stuart had mentioned at the very opening of the meeting. California adopted the 2009 International Fire Code, and when they adopted it, it's now dubbed the 2010 California Fire Code. And when we adopt it locally, we call it the 2011 Glendale Fire Code, or Glendale Building and Safety Code Volume 6. The good news is there are really no significant changes to our fire standards from the previous 2008 edition. There's a lot of work we had to do due to reorganization, renumbering, making sure things were in the right place to maintain what we had previously had in our ordinance. But for the most part, there are really no significant changes. I consider our Bureau to be charged with really three big areas of responsibility. We have environmental management, we have vegetation management, and fire and life safety. And for the most part, like I mentioned, those three areas remain unchanged. Our environmental management program, we're very fortunate that the City of Glendale, back in the 80s and 90s, through the foresight of the fire chief at the time, invested a lot of time and effort into getting Glendale to be recognized as a CUPA. CUPA stands for Certified Unified Program Agency, and basically what that means is that Glendale can perform a full gamut, a full service agency services for environmental related issues such as industrial waste, hazardous material storage, above ground storage tanks, underground storage tanks. In other cities, that would be somewhat fractured amongst a variety of agencies, such as County Public Works for some aspects, County Health Department for some aspects, and the city agency for other aspects, whereas here in Glendale we're able to provide that full range of service. Again, there's no change. We're just reiterating what the programs that we've had and continue to maintain in the city. There is one minor change. We have an agreement internally with the Public Works Division regarding industrial waste. One small aspect of the industrial waste program called FOG, which stands for Fats, Oils, and Grease. Typically, we're talking about restaurants or food service establishments. They have to have a pretreatment system before the fats, oils, and greases can be discharged to the public sewer system. It generally requires a pretreatment system called a grease trap or grease interceptor. And in the past, we've been performing within the fire department plan check and inspection of those pretreatment systems. Now, Public Works has asked to take over the plan check and inspection of the new installations and the ongoing inspections of them. However, we do continue to issue the ongoing operating permits or the annual permits for fog systems. And that's really the only change that's occurred. The other significant program we have is our vegetation management. Being Glendale has a significant, we have a significant high fire hazard area in the city. We've seen brush fire activity pick up, of course, this time of year, and this is definitely a fresh reminder for everyone. And again, there's no major changes here to our program. We have a very robust and complete program for vegetation management. The only changes we had to make are, again, all editorial, making sure things end up in the right place. I'm glad to say that the state is starting to catch up to Glendale because we've had a very forward-thinking ordinance for a long time, and now the state has started to add new chapters to the California Fire Code regarding WUI, which stands for Wildland Urban Interface, and construction standards in the building code. And so we were able, from the last code adoption, we were able to drop a lot of our local amendments to just simply adopt what the state was enacting, and we continue to do so. Next slide. Again, the last probably big program would be fire and life safety, and what I consider the hallmark of the fire life safety element of the Bureau is our fire sprinkler ordinance, which initially passed in 1989, which included sweeping requirements for retrofit of existing buildings and for new construction, which was far more restrictive than the state code at the time. Again, we've maintained those provisions. We haven't made any changes to them since 2008. Some other areas that we had to ensure was intervolume coordination. As was mentioned, there's a brand new residential code adopted by the state for the first time. We're dealing with it. It was a challenge for us to make sure that any residential related provisions in the building and fire code were now reflected in the residential code, which affected us as well. And then the photovoltaic systems, again, a new technology, but there are already hundreds of homes and businesses in Glendale that have installed photovoltaic systems. Why do we care? Maybe raises a few eyebrows. Why would the fire code have provisions for photovoltaic systems? Why wouldn't it be in some other code? But the reason is that, as you'll see, any time you see the news and there's a building fire, you see immediately firefighters on the roof, cutting holes, the ladders on the roof. And why do we do that? It's so critical that whenever there's a building fire, it's critical to ventilate that building, and we do that through vertical ventilation by cutting a hole in the roof. And it relieves the built-up gas and pressure and smoke within the building. It allows the interior attack crew to make an effective attack. It can also aid in the rescue of victims inside. So photovoltaic systems block our access to roof ventilation. And that's one of the reasons that we're very concerned. The other big concern we have is that when we typically show up at a building, one of the things we do is shut off utilities to that building to minimize hazards to the firefighters operating in that structure. The photovoltaic systems don't shut off because they're always collecting solar power. So between the arrays and the master meter, that's always live. That's a DC current, which is always live. So that's a big concern for us. So the provisions, which are actually promulgated by the State Fire Marshal's Office, and we simply adopted their guidelines into the code to make them more consistent and prescriptive. Just incorporate some guidelines on where that conduit can be run, how it's marked and identified, where the disconnect switches are, etc. And I think that's the last slide for Volume 6, the Fire Code. So I'll be happy to try to address any concerns or questions you may have at this time or later.
Chairman Kashishi, members of the board, let me make one comment that piggybacks on something that Fire Marshal Halpert mentioned. He did mention that as a result of our College Hills fire way back in 1989, the City of Glendale adopted mandatory fire sprinkler standards in Glendale. We've been a little bit spoiled here due to the steps that our fire department has taken to protect our community. And that's why we have not seen since then any conflagration level events. It's interesting that on January 1st of next year, 2011, that will be the first time that the rest of the state of California as a whole will catch up to Glendale and mandatorily require residential sprinklers in every single new home. While there are other communities that are as progressive as Glendale, the first one that actually was ahead of us being San Clemente, it's really just a small handful of communities that have really led the way, and as a result, a higher proportion of our community in Glendale is already sprinklered due to the efforts of our Fire Prevention Bureau. So as a result, our community is to this day, from a fire sprinkler standpoint, ahead of the curve compared to other communities in California. And as I mentioned, January 1st, 2011, when this code takes effect, this will be the first time the rest of the entire state will be on a mandatory residential fire sprinkler standard.
Thank you for that report. Mr. Halbert, in addition to sprinkler system that Mr. Tom just mentioned, do we have wood roof ordinance also in the city, in hillside areas?
Yes, we do. Actually, again, one of those provisions that was enacted early on was a wood roof prohibition. Wood roofs were prohibited in Glendale, and we even further we were even more restrictive than that. The state code allows Class A, Class B, and Class C roofing assemblies.
Right.
And Class C assemblies were never allowed in Glendale, I think, since 1989 as well. And in the high fire hazard areas, we restricted roof assemblies to Class A only. So in the rest of the city, you could choose between Class A and Class B. In high fire hazard area, only Class A is permitted.
To take that even one step further, while you could read between the lines of what Fire Marshal Halpert said, he indicated that in the very high fire hazard severity zones, we only allow Class A. There is a Class A fire retardant treated wood shingle product that has been commercially available in California for years. We do not even allow the Class A fire retardant treated wood shake here in Glendale. We have a total prohibition on wood roofing materials regardless of fire resistance rating.
Isn't that, can I ask a clarifying question? It was always my impression, though, that we had grandfathered in old buildings that had unapproved wood shake, and that we still have some of those. I thought there were some in my own neighborhood.
That is, Board Member Dantler, members of the board, that is correct. The standard that we have here is that new construction may not have any wood roofing materials, and furthermore, we have a trigger by which, if there are additions of a certain size or even repairs to existing buildings that exceed a 25% threshold, that the remainder of the roof would have to be replaced. So since all roofing materials eventually wear out, over time, every single wood roof in the city of Glendale will eventually be replaced, and they are slowly disappearing from Glendale.
Sure, but right now we don't have anywhere in our code an ability for an adjacent neighbor or a group of neighbors to ask for the city's help to bring about that kind of loss by attrition and to speed that up, so that if I'm next door to somebody with an ancient wood shake roof, unless that homeowner chooses to repair or replace beyond that trigger level, I'm still living next door to an unsafe roof. I'm personally not, but I know in my neighborhood some people are, and I just want to make sure that the public does understand that correctly. When we talk about people having been, quote, grandfathered in with these old roofs, we're really waiting for those roofs to go away by attrition, correct? We don't have a mechanism in the city codes.
That's correct.
Okay. Did I cut you off with another
No, not at all.
Sorry.
In fact, you were just in line. In fact, I was going to continue with so I guess you clarify that any re-roofing also will require to be Class A. It's not any new construction. If you just have an existing home and if you want to re-roof, it has to be Class A roofing or no wood at all.
But not a minor roof repair, I understand.
Right.
In the hillside.
In the hillside area, exactly.
That's correct.
But do we have an ordinance that also says, for instance, until such and such date, you're allowed to keep your existing wood roof, but after that, then everyone is basically has to comply with such thing?
No, there's no sunset clause.
There is no sunset clause. Okay, great.
With the recent San Bruno incident, is the city of Glendale, especially the fire department, are we looking into integrating any additional measures or anything to be able to address such incidents if it does arise?
Well, we're definitely very interested in the events that have happened there. Very tragic reminder of the hazards that we have in a modern society. And the State Fire Marshal's Office actually regulates pipeline safety. And we've been involved for years in the issue of pipeline safety when it comes to new installations. But perhaps I might be able to call upon Vaskin Demirjian, our environmental management coordinator, might be able to give you a little more insight, if you don't mind, Vaskin. Some of the history and what's been done in the past and what we continue to do regarding pipeline safety and our involvement in that issue.
Or maybe just a process suggestion. I wonder if maybe that's something we want to agendize for a future meeting, since it's not really on our calendar today, and the public might be interested in that if we had it as an agenda item for a future meeting. Just to avoid a segue that takes us in a direction off of the code amendments.
That's a good suggestion. Why don't we do this? Since we do have to return to the board in a month to present to you our final draft that we would like eventually to go to the City Council, why don't we prepare a brief oral report on pipeline safety at that time?
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
I'd just like to throw in one last comment before we continue to Volume 7. I just want to acknowledge we have two staff members in the room that have done a lot of work on the code. I just want to acknowledge them, Vaskin Demirjian, who has just stepped up a moment ago, Foster McLean, who's here, not represented here in the room, but in spirit, Doug Nichols, Keith Kawamoto, Jovan Diaz, Joe Morelli, and fire engineer Kevin Widner, who actually served in the Fire Prevention Bureau a few years ago. He's back in the fire station, but he remains very committed to the Bureau, and he helped work on this code from the fire station while he's on duty and at home. So I just want to recognize all the staff that have worked very hard to get us to this point.
Yes.
Two more quick questions about
Sure.
the fire code. And kudos to everyone who worked on it.
Thank you.
They're to be commended. Now, the fire department is my personal favorite department, since my family lives in a high fire hazard area. Well, maybe second only to the building department in my heart. So bear with me when I just ask two more quick questions.
Take your absolutely.
One thing that I was interested in is what looks to me like a new section that's requiring homeowners to to illuminate their street numbers. Is that new, or is that just something I didn't know we were supposed to be doing?
Actually, that is it's not a new amendment this go-around. It was new in the last code adoption. The reason you see it underlined here in your packet is because it's a new amendment to what the state's adopted. So you won't find it in the state code, and so that's why it's underlined here in your packet as a new Glendale amendment, but it is the same amendment that we had adopted previously. And again, it only applies to new construction, so we don't go to existing homes and require them to provide illumination on their address numbers, but we would certainly encourage,
It sounds like a good
remind
idea.
the public to, finding the address numbers, particularly at night, can be very challenging. And
So that's the preferred approach that the fire department recommend, but we're not making that a new mandatory requirement for existing construction.
no, not for existing. This only applies to new construction.
My other quick question, I expect it's in a different part of the code, forgive me. Barred windows, I know, are sometimes a concern for fire department.
Yes.
Are
that's
barred
actually
windows
addressed.
in a different part of the building code?
Yes, you won't find it in this packet because we didn't make any amendments to those provisions, but the state actually does address barred windows, and the state does, just to give you a quick, brief summary, barred windows are allowed, and when they are covering what's called an emergency rescue window, which would be a window in your sleeping room, it's required to have an opening mechanism that the occupant from inside can open and escape in a fire. But on other windows, such as a living room or a dining room, it's not required to be openable.
And does that apply to new construction as well as existing construction?
Yes.
The
Yes.
openability of
Yes.
the bedroom?
Yes, it
Okay.
does.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking that. That's a very important question.
Mr. Alfred, one last question, going back to the roof material,
Yes, sir.
if you don't mind. Do we allow wood siding on hillside areas?
In our last code adoption, we actually, I'm sorry, 2 code adoptions ago, when we had our own high fire hazard area construction requirements, we had actually prohibited wood siding. Since the state had introduced Chapter 7A, and Stuart actually can address this much more expertly than I can, the state actually adopted standards which introduced the concept of ignition-resistant materials on the exterior skin of the house. It didn't quite, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't prohibit wood siding, but it required a certain performance standard that wood siding would have to meet if you were to use wood siding. Is that correct?
Thank
Stuart?
you. Fire Marshal Halpert is actually right on the money. I'm impressed. The 12th volume, or the 12th part, I should say, of Title 24 are the standards. Chapter 12 within the California standards are the state fire marshal's standards. There are 5 standards that the state fire marshal has added to the code, which are directly related to ignition resistance of buildings, and one of them has to do with siding. Therefore, any material can be used for the exterior of a building, even in a very high fire hazard area, if the material as proposed to be installed can be tested in a laboratory and proven to meet a certain standard. And in order to do that, there's a prescribed method of putting a burner up to the material with a particular heat flux, and without getting into too many details, if that material can resist sustained ignition, it can be used. In addition to that, because they have tested it and found it to be so reliable, the change that Fire Marshal Halpert referred to, our previous prohibition, has been taken out. And under our new standards of Chapter 7A, which are the Wildland Urban Interface Ignition Resistance Standards, any wood siding may be applied to the side of a building if it is directly underlain by one layer of 5/8 inch exterior Type X gypsum sheathing, which is different than gypsum board. And the reason for that is if it's applied directly to the gypsum sheathing and oxygen cannot get behind, while wood siding will burn as long as a torch or a burner is applied to it. When the burner is taken away, the wood siding would self-extinguish. And so as a result, we will allow that. So that's a very different application, and it's a special application compared to what I think you referred to. Your typical wood siding is wood siding applied to some type of weather-resistant building felt or something of that nature, applied just to the studding. When that's done, you have the entire stud cavity, and every 16 inches there's a lot of oxygen there. The wood siding can actually catch on fire, and a building that's sheathed with wood siding will burn very rapidly. But by requiring it to be applied directly to gypsum sheathing, it can't burn. And so we will now allow it if it's installed in that very, very special fashion.
And would that be acceptable for the entire house, or just a portion, or a percentage, or something?
That would be allowed in the entire house.
Okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
Other questions?
Okay, and now we can move on to Volume 7, which is the security standards. The security standards are similar to the 2008 Glendale Building Safety Code. Just to give you a little bit of background on security standards, we haven't really updated that standard since 1982. We've added a couple of the amendments, and one of the amendments that you see is to upgrade some of the deadbolt requirements to a more current standard, which is complying with Grade 1 ANSI designation deadbolt locks. And that's basically to a standard that measures security and durability of the lock, of the door lock. The other amendment that we've added was administratively. We've clearly defined the definition for demising wall in the security standards. And third, we also now have included and added the smoking ordinance 5686 into the security standards, and this is regarding identifying those non-smoking units and smoking areas for multifamily residential.
While this last bullet may not sound like a security standard, let me explain why this is here. You all may recall that shortly ago, the city of Glendale took huge strides to eventually become a smoke-free community, and as a result, we have standards which prohibit smoking in certain areas, and in other areas, especially within residential buildings, a certain number of units are required to be smoke-free, and they're supposed to be designated smoking units. When that ordinance was considered by our city council, one of the standards that was imposed by ordinance 5686 was that there be a legend or a map which identifies which units in a multi-unit residential apartment building are those smoking units. Great idea, so that if you were looking for an apartment and you choose to smoke, you would know whether or not you are looking at an apartment unit in an area of the building that is likely to have smoke. If you really do not like the smell of smoke and the unit that is available is right next to a bunch of other units, you might choose to look at another unit. Fantastic idea, but in order to enforce that ordinance, it required that a map or legend be provided on site. Since our Volume 7 has always required an illuminated map legend of that facility that shows where all of the units are, so that if for no other reason, if there was an emergency and responders showed up to a 100-unit apartment building and they were looking for one particular unit because they received a 911 call, they would see exactly where to go. It made common sense. Why don't we integrate the smoking provisions into the map that we require under the Building and Safety Code for security provisions, so there won't be two maps in the lobby. And so when we were requested to do that by our Neighborhood Services Division, we agreed to put that in the security standard. So while no smoking doesn't sound like a security standard, it's to integrate two maps into one.
Okay, moving on to Volume 8, which is the Commercial Industrial Property Maintenance Code. Again, proposed amendments here are similar to the previous code. No changes were proposed here as well. The next item is a Volume 9, which is new to Glendale. That is the Green Building Standards, and just to give you status on where that is, it will be determined by City Council on September 28th of this month. And I think maybe if Stuart wants to add anything to that.
Oh, sure. What the heck? This community has been very, very active in development of our green building standards. Some of you may be aware of the fact that California is the first, and actually it's the only state in the entire country that has adopted a statewide green building code. We are clearly setting the way for a sustainable future, and Glendale wanted to be a part of that. Prior to the state's adoption of a statewide code, our city council had already given direction to move forward, see what might be best for this community, see what other communities are doing. And so various public meetings had already been established to do that. During that process, the state moved forward and adopted a code. That helped Glendale with its decision because there were a lot of different possibilities. Should we go with the state building green building standards code? Should we go with a system similar to LEED? Should we go with a system similar to the Greenpoint rated system? Should we develop our own custom solution here in Glendale? So far we have decided to do is to move in a direction which is consistent with the state mandatory green standards with some other possible augmentation of those green building standards. That will be presented to the City Council on September 28th. So if any of you, excuse me, I apologize. So if any of you are interested in following that, I invite you to stay tuned to our council meeting on September 28th, where we will hopefully get our last bit of direction from the City Council. And then when we get that last bit of direction from the City Council, we will be integrating into this package our green building standards. Okay.
And as far as a timeline, these are some of the critical dates that we're trying to pursue. Right now, we're at 9:15, which we are presenting to you today. On 10:20 will be the final presentation to this board, and also on 11/02/2010, we're trying to get slated for the ordinance to be introduced at City Council, and concurrently after that would be on 11/16 to have the ordinance adopted at City Council meeting, and then on effective 1/01/2011, that will be the effective date of the code.
Can you go back one slide? Thank you. I'd like to point out and thank this board, by the way, for allowing us to impose upon you to serve as a sounding board for our development. Most jurisdictions, certainly those within LA County, don't even take advantage of the first two bullets that you see on this timeline. They generally go through the process of developing their local amendment package, going through the legally required process of introduction and adoption through their city councils, and that's it. Here in Glendale, we have always valued the time and expertise that you provide to this, which is why we present this not just once, but also twice to this board. It turns out that as a result, it does help us out because we are ahead of the game, so to speak. Unfortunately, in order to be ahead of the game, it imposes a lot of pressure and a lot of work on city staff. I do want to acknowledge publicly that I fully understand the pressure that this has placed on the city attorney's office, and in particular Chris Sansoni, because this is a lot of material to review in a short period of time. And I do want to one last time acknowledge staff for doing this. But if you go back to that timeline, what you see is that we are at this first bullet, 9:15, and we're going to come back to you again on October 20th to give you an idea, or publicly to present what we believe is going to be our final draft to the City Council. To put it into perspective where the City of Glendale is right now, there are 88 incorporated jurisdictions within LA County. Counting the unincorporated portion of LA County, that would be 89 jurisdictions. Out of the 89 jurisdictions in LA County, I'm aware of only one that is as far advanced with their adoption process as we are. And I hate to admit it because we're usually the first. LA County is a couple weeks ahead of us. But aside from LA County, every single one of the other 88 jurisdictions, actually 87 if you take us and the county out, is lagging behind us. And some of them have been contacting us asking if they could get copies of this because they knew that it was going to be presented today. So one last time, thank you very much for allowing us to use you as a public sounding board, and thank you to everyone who's helped on this.
Not that it's a competition.
No, not a competition. I wish we were first, though.
Thank you. Again, and some of the other dates here that I discussed were the effective dates of the code. Again, a plan check application submitted after January 1st must be designed in accordance with the new code, and anyone who wishes to purchase the codes can go online at these websites, and also training is available at the following websites as well. And that concludes our presentation of the 2011 Glendale Building Safety Code. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. With that wraps up our staff presentation of our initial public introduction of this package. If there are any last questions, be happy to address them, or else we can move on.
No question. I just want to say that on behalf of this board also, we do appreciate and value the time and the effort and the hard work that the staff has put into this. I happen to be involved myself in this process, and I know how time-consuming it is. So definitely, this board also does appreciate your time and the efforts. Thank you so much, and it was a very comprehensive report. Thanks. So with that, I guess we can move on to the next item. Report, building and safety report.
Thank you, Chairman Kashishi and members of the board. To wrap up today's meeting, if you turn to the last tab in your packet, you will find our traditional monthly report that is labeled July 2010. Despite the fact that it is already September, you will recall that some time ago I had approached this board and I had indicated that due to the time necessary to prepare our monthly reports, there is a slight lag of 2 months. But let me go over this report, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to address them. On this particular report, you will notice that July is the first month of our fiscal reporting period. So in all of the columns, the numbers seem pretty small compared to what you are typically accustomed to. As an example, if you take a look at the first page, monthly income summary, you'll notice that for our current month, July, the first month of the fiscal year, if you were to take a look at all of the different income sources for building and safety, the fees that we bring in for building permits, the fees that we bring in for building plan checks, plumbing, electrical permits, and mechanical, electrical, and plumbing plan checks, etc. The income for building and safety that particular month was $238,000 and change. What's interesting is if you compare it to the same period same period last year, it's pretty close, $263,225. So while the economy is still hurting us, some people had felt that it was going to continue to decline further. That decline is apparent, but it's pretty minor. This is a pretty good sign. As most of you know, one of the leading indicators of the health of our economy are housing starts. And a good portion of the fees and the plan check revenues that we do here in Glendale is directly related to housing construction. So keep your fingers crossed. I hope this is a good sign. What I would like to do is, without going into detail, the entire first page has all of the different revenue sources that Building and Safety is responsible for collecting. About the top 25% of this page is directly related to Building and Safety. And then some of the other revenue sources are things that we collect for other agencies. What's important to note is at the very, very bottom of this page, under the column marked current month, the total revenue that was brought in that month was slightly more than $250,000 at $270,596, which if you compare that to the same period last year, it's actually a little bit higher. The same period last year was $268,220. So as a result, if this is indicative of things starting to turn around, that would be a real good sign. In the box right above my signature on this report, you'll see that there is a figure that is referred to as our cost recovery ratio. And what this is representative of the ratio between how much revenue we bring in and how much it costs me to run Glendale's building department. There is always, by necessity, some degree of subsidy because some of what we do to support our community's activities is not directly related to a particular individual's construction project. It is just for the good of the community. And that turns out to be, in general, about 30% cost recovery. We brought in sufficient revenue that particular month that instead of having our target cost recovery ratio of 0.70, we were at 0.955. So we actually brought in more than what would ordinarily be projected. To close out my report, if you turn the page to the back, our building activity report, this will give you an idea of what type of activity there was. Things were relatively slow in terms of the valuation of our projects, although while it it was relatively slow, it was significantly higher than this same month last year. If you take a look about 2/3 of the way down the column, rather than getting into all of the individual breakout, it lines up just under row 23. You'll see that in the month of July, this 1 month, the total valuation of construction in the city of Glendale was about $7.75 million. To be precise, $7,710,114. Comparatively speaking, if we were to take a look at last year, to give you an idea of what the economy was looking like, the valuation of all work for that same 1 month period last year was only $4.3 million. So comparing 4.3 to 7.7 million, we're starting to approach almost double the valuation of work. So that's pretty good. If you take a look at the very bottom box, our valuation summary, customer count, what I generally like to do is give an idea of how busy we are. In terms of our customer count, what you'll see is that for the month of July, we had 1,800. Wow, this is the first time I've ever seen this. We've had, we had 1,803 customers walk through our doors. This is an actual count of warm bodies that walks through Building and Safety's front doors, 1,803. If you were to take a look at our previous month, while the valuation was almost half, we actually had more people last year at about 2,200. Individuals, so about 400 more people were coming in last year. The reason for that, a lot of people were coming in trying to find out what they could do based on their limited budgets. A lot of the work that we did last year, the same period, never actually resulted in a project. It was still work that staff had to do, helping them out, giving out information, reviewing their proposals, and so forth. But a lot of that actually never generated any real work. But this particular period, 1,800 people through our doors, still pretty busy. And with that, I would say that building and safety and development in the city of Glendale is healthy. And like I said, I hope this is a good sign that our economy is turning around. And with that, I would be happy to address any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you for that report, and we certainly hope so that this is the end of the recession, and hopefully things will pick up.
I certainly hope they will. I think that the pickup will be rather gradual. I think people are cautious, especially when it's related to things as significant as construction. But it is a good sign. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Any questions?
No
Any
questions.
discussion? Well, I guess if there's no other questions, can we adjourn?
We are at item number 8. Well, before we adjourn, we need a motion for adjournment.
Oh, do we have to? All right. Motion to adjourn?
I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll second the motion.
Okay. So this meeting is so adjourned. Thank you.